Trump's envoy Steve Witkoff on secret mission in Moscow. Is it true? Trump announced his conversation with Volodymyr Zelenskiy this week, and how Ukraine has essentially agreed to $500 billion mineral deal. We'll talk about this with Mark Toth, a national security and foreign policy writer whose work appears regularly in The Hill, New York Post, and Kyiv Post, among other publications. Mr. Toth, I'm very glad to see you, and thank you for joining us.
A pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
According to Flight Radar 24, a business jet was recorded entering Russian airspace in the morning. A Gulfstream G650ER business jet arrived in Moscow from Washington. It is reported that Steve Witkoff, a close associate of former US President Donald Trump, may have been on board. For what purpose? How do you think? Is it true? It can be true. What diplomatic implications could arise from Steve Witkoff's visit to Moscow amid current geopolitical tensions?
Yeah, it's a great question that's breaking news overnight here in the U.S. And the plane does indeed appear to be owned by a company that Steve Witkoff controls. Now, it's of note, though, that he is Trump's special envoy to the Mideast. And I think a lot of people, based on what I've seen early on, have been thinking that this is Ukraine connected. I highly suspect, can't know, I'm just speculating here, but I highly suspect this has more to do with Iran and what Trump is trying to achieve there. Because if people recollect, just in the last couple of days, Tehran has come out and said, we're not going to negotiate with Trump. So it could be that Steve Witkoff, if he is there, again, no confirmation, has been dispatched to Putin to basically say, hey, or to the Foreign Secretary Lavrov to say, it's in your best interest to get Iran to talk to us because we're serious about putting an end to Iran's nuclear program. So I'm not convinced this is so much about Ukraine as it is about Iran.
Mark, US President Donald Trump has announced that he will speak with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskiy this week, and an upcoming visit by his special envoy for Ukraine and Russia, reported by Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. About details, Trump's statement comes as preparations are underway for the Munich Security Conference, which begins on the 14th of February. The White House will send Kit Kellogg, the special envoy for Ukraine and Russia, to Munich, where he plans to meet Zelenskiy in person during the conference. What key topics, how do you think, will be discussed during the meeting between President Trump and President Zelenskiy, and not only? How does the United States plan to support Ukraine during the upcoming Munich Security Conference?
Yeah, no, great question. Let me kind of break that down a bit. I think overall, it's important for Ukraine to understand this is a momentous week. You have a lot going on in Europe. You've got the NATO security conference that's happening. You've got the Munich conference that's happening. I'm sorry, the NATO contact group that's happening in Brussels that Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth will be attending. You've got the Munich security conference that J.D. Vance is going to be attending, and your own President Volodymyr Zelenskiy attending. Then you've got Kyiv Kellogg soon to be dispatched to Kiev. On February 20th is it being reported here in the U.S. So lots happening. And on top of that, you have Trump in this telephone call that's supposed to be happening between him and President Zelensky. So I think what we're really seeing here out of Washington is a combined effort to set conditions. We often talk about setting conditions on the battlefield. I think this is about getting Washington's messaging out to set conditions on the negotiating stage to make sure that Washington sees each actor trying to come to the table in good faith and in a workable way. For Trump, though, if we look at his worldview, he tends to see things through dollars first and then the strategic side of it subsequently. And for him, I think, and for Ukraine especially, even though personally I think it's an unfair ask, I think Ukrainians have more than paid the price with their own treasure, with their own blood in fighting this fight for Western liberty. But in Trump's mind, this $500 billion rare earth mineral deal is something that Ukraine can seize upon because the asset value of these rare earth minerals in Ukraine is immense. It's estimated as upwards of $11.5 trillion. And so I think that's, the chief point that Trump wants to be bringing up with Zelensky is to say, for continued U.S. aid, you've got to help us out there. We've got to get paid back. Now, if I'm Zelensky, I'm taking this opportunity to remind Trump that half of that value, and this has been estimated and appeared in Reuters, Half of that value in terms of rare earth minerals is trapped inside of Russian occupied areas of Ukraine, especially the Donbass. So if I'm Zelensky, I'm telling Trump, look, this is great. You want this, we're willing to do this, but you've got to help us get the Donbass back. We can't cede that as part of any negotiation process. So lots happening this week, lots to unpack.
We'll wait for more information. And also we see that, yes, President Donald Trump's administration has decided to oppose the development of peace plan for Ukraine to hold talks with European partners. Reported by The Telegraph, it's one article. The Telegraph states that Kit Kellogg, Trump's special envoy for Ukraine and Russia, promised European diplomats that he would consult with NATO allies before finalizing the peace plan. The Telegraph reports that Kellogg promised to hold talks with the prime ministers and presidents of NATO states. What role does NATO play in shaping the final version of this peace plan? How might consultations with European partners influence the U.S. approach to resolving the war?
Yeah, I think if we go back to this theme that I'm raising this week is about setting conditions. Trump clearly wants NATO overall to be doing more. He's called for them to increase their defense spending to 5% GDP versus the 2% target that it is now. And many of them aren't even at that. You know, Germany is behind that figure. France is behind that figure. And so he wants them to be doing more. I think this pause really has more to do with trying to get NATO to realize that you just can't take U.S. participation for granted, that if you want the U.S. to be involved in any end state when it comes to Ukraine, that you're going to have to be doing more. And I think this is to get buy-in, in part, what Kellogg is trying to do, what's being reported in the Telegraph. But I think it's also a wake-up call to NATO to say you just can't take us for granted. Now, having said that, if Trump's going to negotiate a $500 billion deal with Zelenskyy for these rare earth minerals, there's no way, in my mind, and this is just my personal opinion, that the U.S. won't have some kind of role in making sure that Ukraine's security is guaranteed going forward. We all know the failures of the Budapest Memorandum. We know the failures of the two Minsk agreements. Without NATO backing, I just don't see how any kind of lasting peace can happen in Ukraine, because we've just seen too many times where Putin takes a pause, reloads, and then just comes back for more of Ukraine. So NATO, in my mind, is ultimately going to be key. It's just a question of how do we get there? How do we get NATO to come on board? And how ultimately do we get Trump to basically understand that without NATO, his $500 billion deal isn't going to be worth very much?
Also, Mike Waltz, National Security Advisor to U.S. President Donald Trump, has stated that Europe should take responsibility for Ukrainian security guarantees after the war, and that the United States should recover its military aid cost through partnership on rare earth metals. As you said, reported by Waltz in an interview with NBC, if we talk about a quote, he said that, "I think an underlying principle here is that the Europeans have to own this conflict war going forward. President Trump is going to end it, and then in terms of security guarantees, that is squarely going to be with the Europeans." Why such rhetoric? How do you see Europe's role in ensuring Ukrainian security guarantees after the war?
Right. Yeah. As I just mentioned, I think this is really about getting Europe to wake up. There's definitely a big threat that Putin not only poses in the current time frame in Europe, but potentially long term. And if you look deep down, you see other statements that are coming from Mike Waltz, coming from Pete Hegseth. For instance, with Pete Hegseth in the Defense Department press release about his upcoming trip, and it's in progress as we speak now, to Brussels, to Germany, and to Poland. He called Poland a model NATO ally because Poland is almost at 5% GDP spending. And so I think what Mike Waltz is trying to do here is to echo that messaging that began with Trump, is to say, Europe, you've got to be doing more. You can't take our participation for granted. And again, I think at the end of the day, I doubt any kind of long-term security arrangements in Ukraine as the result of any peace or ceasefire deal I doubt those are sans U.S. involvement. I think the U.S. will be involved. But for right now, I think what Trump is trying to do is get Europe to wake up. You've got this major threat. It's closest to you as opposed to us, and you need to be doing more. But again, I'm very confident that the U.S. will be there at the end of the day, because there's no other way to secure that $500 billion deal unless U.S. forces back it up as well.
Also, Mark, do you agree with a statement that Europe cannot guarantee Ukrainian security without the United States of America?
Yeah, I agree. Europe on its own cannot. Can Europe be doing more to protect itself and ultimately Ukraine by extension? Absolutely. And I think that's what Trump is trying to accomplish here, which is to say, Europe, you've been riding on our coattails long enough from a defensive standpoint. You've got to be doing more. And I think, Ukraine in that regard is a shining example. If you want one country in addition to Poland that has really been doing the most, it's Ukraine. I mean, Ukraine arguably has done more to safeguard NATO in these last almost 3 years now, as we approach the end of this month and the third year this war comes to an end, and we go into the fourth. Ukraine has done the most of any country in terms of protecting Europe. And so from that standpoint, I'm hopeful. I think we're headed in the right direction. I think ultimately Trump will get that. But again, Europe is not going to be able to do this on its own. I don't think you're going to see the U.S. do it unilaterally either. I think this is really a question that it comes down to. It's got to be NATO. It's got to be NATO that ultimately provides the guarantees. And in my opinion, I'll just add this last brief point. I do believe that it's key for Ukraine to become part of NATO. I've called for that with my writing partner, Colonel Jonathan Sweet, who is a former U.S. Army intelligence officer. We've both said that Ukraine has already earned the right to be in NATO with what they've accomplished on the battlefield. And I think NATO is the best safeguard for Ukraine going forward.
Mark, we talk about Munich conference and also about Ramstein, because I see, according to the Washington Post, that new U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth will take part in the week's Ukraine Defense Contact Group meeting, Ramstein meetings. However, he's unlikely to announce new military aid for Ukrainian army, according to the Washington Post. Hegseth will attend the Ramstein meeting scheduled for tomorrow, February 12th, at NATO headquarters in Brussels for the first time since the start of the full-scale war. The meeting was convened not by the US, but by the UK. Your own expectation?
Yeah, I think at this point, this early on in the administration, Hegseth is going to be more in a managerial kind of role with the Pentagon itself. I don't expect a lot of policy decisions to be coming from Hegseth himself. I think we need to be looking to Lieutenant General Keith Kellogg, Trump's special envoy to Ukraine and to Russia, and for what he is saying. And while there may not be a package release like there had been more of lately from the Biden administration in their waning days, I do see encouraging signs coming from, or indications, if you will, coming from Kellogg in the sense of, for instance, as just was reported by the Kyiv Post in Ukraine, that Kellogg said, look, if Russia doesn't come to the table, doesn't understand that we want to end this war and end it on terms that are equitable, we can increase the sanctions. And he basically pointed out that the U.S. economic sanctions at this point, in his mind, from a pain level, are only a 3 out of 10, and that we can increase and intensify that. So, I think we're starting to see these signs that the U.S. is willing to ramp up pressure. And I think ultimately, if that means added weapons packages, that's going to happen too. We're already seeing reports that the Trump administration has freed up Ukraine to use deep strike precision weapons inside of Russia without the restrictions that have been unfairly imposed upon Ukraine by the Biden administration, in effect creating sanctuary for Russian troops so you couldn't interdict them before they reach the battlefield. So we're seeing things going in the right direction. I wouldn't get caught up in the rhetoric as much of what we're hearing from these different leaders. I'd be looking to the actions. And at this point, while I'm always one that's going to advocate for the U.S. to be doing more to help Ukraine, I see positive indications that at least it's going in the right direction.
Mark, if we talk about Donald Trump, yes, President Donald Trump stated that the United States has made tremendous progress in negotiations with Moscow and Kyiv over the past week, and a peace deal may soon be reached, according to the New York Post. And Trump said that I think it's going to happen. Trump said regarding a potential peace agreement between Ukraine and Russia, and the US president confirmed that negotiations are currently underway with both sides. And also, he told Fox News, quote, "I think we have made tremendous progress in the last week. We're dealing with the Russians, we're dealing with the Ukrainians. I think there is going to be something." And also, we see that Trump says he's spoken with Putin as Russia's war in Ukraine approaches third anniversary. What do you think about this contact between Putin and Trump for today?
Yeah, it's definitely a fair question to be asking, and again, I would start to answer it by reminding people it's important not to get caught up in the words of Trump and the rhetoric of Trump, because he tends to be bombastic, he tends to be optimistic, he tends to overestimate things in terms of timelines and the like. In other words, he's basically articulating a vision for how he wants things to happen, but real life is a little bit more difficult, as you know. Bringing realities into ultimate end states that would result in a peaceful Ukraine is easier said than done. And so from that standpoint, I think Trump is just basically trying to say, look, this is what I want to see happen. This is what I'm trying to will, if you will, that he wants to have happen. But when it comes down to it, there's a lot of heavy lifting yet to be done. I also think you've got to look to Trump's own negotiating style. This is a man who's a businessman for most of his life. The Art of the Deal is his book, that he famously co-wrote with a ghostwriter. And basically, he sees this as a mano-to-mano type situation where he's got to negotiate with the major players one-on-one, be that with President Zelensky, be that with Putin, and the like. And so I think that's where you see him injecting himself, if you will, in what other presidents may have tried to accomplish first with less, formal committees and contacts. Trump is going to try to bypass that and speed it up by doing it personally. More of a kind of a big three World War II type thing, where he's the one driving the force. I think what he's going to find, though, is that Putin is not ready to concede much yet. I just don't see much out of Moscow where they are going to say, other than something that they would view advantageous from a ceasefire standpoint, they're not ready to give up on their designs of Ukraine. And I think it's important for Ukraine to realize that, to understand that no matter what we may be hearing out of Moscow and the Kremlin, they're not ready to stop yet. They don't think they've lost this yet. They still believe, in my opinion, in terms of the thinking in the Kremlin, especially the thinking of Putin, is that they can still achieve on the negotiating table what their military has failed to do on the battlefield. So I think we're still in for a long haul here. I don't think this gets solved quickly. I hope for the Ukrainian people's sake it does, as long as they get all of their territories back. And in my mind, that includes Crimea. But again, I think Trump is trying to will a certain situation. It's just going to be a lot harder to reach in reality.
About support for Ukraine, about help, yes, Republican Congressman Joe Wilson announced his plan to introduce the Freedom First Land Lease Act to Congress on February 10th, and also reauthorizing this program would grant, yes, President Donald Trump the authority to send Ukraine weapons through Lend-Lease. Wilson argued that this initiative would help deter war criminal Vladimir Putin, and he claimed that former U.S. President Joe Biden should have taken similar action earlier. Bring Russia to the table through American strengths, Wilson wrote on X. What is the main purpose of the Freedom First Lend-Lease Act? How would this how this act impact U.S. military support for Ukraine? And is it possible to use Lend-Lease?
Yeah, I suspect that the Lend-Lease concept has a lot more to do with messaging to the American people about Ukraine than it does for the Ukrainians themselves. I think in terms of paying for this deal, Trump has already signaled how he wants to do that. That's through the $500 billion proposed rare earth minerals deal. Lend-Lease, I think, is trying to put it in the minds of the American people that this is not kind of an endless money pit. Now, I don't view it that way. I view every dollar spent in Ukraine as beneficial to Western liberty. But in their minds, it's basically trying to convince the average American, someone who's not as up to date on Ukraine, doesn't fully understand what Ukraine is fighting for, doesn't completely understand the implications to U.S. national security if Ukraine doesn't win. It's trying to create a rationale for them to say, here's why your tax dollars make sense to be given to Ukraine up front, and here's how you get paid back so that you're not the one ultimately footing the bill. So I think a lot of that is for domestic U.S. consumption, whereas I would be paying more attention personally to what Trump is saying. And I think Joe Wilson is just trying to create that. For the Republican Party, for many people, there's going to have to be a shift to explain why suddenly they weren't supportive of Ukrainian aid. But now that they are, one is going to be that rationale to justify it to the Republican base. But the other is going to be more along the lines of trying to argue, and rightly so, that Biden had it in his power to bring this war to an end much sooner. But he put these crazy kind of restrictions on Ukraine's military, and we didn't supply things quick enough. I mean, we could spend the rest of today going through the long list of equipment, Patriots, ATACMS, long-range precision weapons, 16s, that were slow-walked to Ukraine, years in the making to get some of these military assets to the battlefield and munitions to the battlefield. And even once they got there, the restrictions were just crazy. So, I'm positive about where we're headed. And I think that Joe Wilson is just trying to show the American people that, hey, we've got skin in the game, and here's why it makes sense for you and me to help make this happen.
Mark, I thank you for this interesting, very important conversation. I was very glad to see you, and I need to say that Mark Toth, a national security and foreign policy writer whose work appears regularly in the Hill, New York Post and Kyiv Post, among other publications. Mark, I wish you all the best. Thank you for supporting Ukraine. Thank you for supporting our country, and see you